My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I never expect to see you anymore. I'm going back to North Carolina.
I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join us as we quest for the awe and wonder of knowing we are part of something infinitely larger than ourselves.
My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I never expect to see you anymore. This may sound kind of over the top, but I felt like it was my duty as another family member stepping into this home to do the best I could to keep it up. This is a place that may carry on and someone might come behind me and live in it.
Jeremy B. Jones is a writer and professor, born and raised in the mountains of western North Carolina, a region his family has called home for nearly 200 years. After several years of wandering in distant places his young heart thought would be more exciting, for a while even living as far away as Central America, Jeremy made his way back to the familiar mountains that raised him. As this episode of Constant Wonder unfolds, keep in mind two questions that we all might very well ask ourselves. First, how can I ever know who I really am at heart? And second, can I ever really know where it is that I belong? Upon returning to the land of his childhood, Jeremy Jones and his wife settled into an old farmhouse next to the Mills River in Henderson County. It was a place that felt exactly right the moment they found it, though the reasons why were yet to present themselves. Then, in September of 2024, not long after moving into that farmhouse, Hurricane Helene ravaged western North Carolina round about Asheville, the most populous city in the region. It was the costliest natural disaster in North Carolina history, with well over 100 reported fatalities and thousands of others displaced from their homes. On a personal level, the disaster would test not just the Joneses' old farmhouse itself, but the family's resolve to stay put.
My home's across the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I never expect to see you anymore.
The hurricane came in the September of 2024. Where were you? What did you experience? Just in terms of that horrific inundation.
And in a lot of ways, like a lot of people, I was caught pretty unawares. I remember driving home the afternoon before the hurricane and the storm kind of hit us, wondering if my kid was going to have soccer practice that afternoon. And so I was not expecting, and I think a lot of us were not expecting what came. We live on a river, and we had to leave, expecting the waters would come, and then ultimately discovered that our house had gotten hit pretty hard in the hurricane.
So you actually were away from the home when the damage happened?
We went, just to an Airbnb for the night, and we're lucky that we did. We would have been trapped up the mountain because our house was flooded, the bridge was washed out, and there was no way out of the little community we live in.
And I understand that before you got news of the damage, you had already kind of scoped out the possibility by consulting with some sort of, who was it, a meteorologist or a friend of yours who knew about floods?
Yeah, I have a hydrologist friend, and anytime I have a question about water tables or rainfall, I send him texts. And so I asked him how he thought our house would do if it was going to float away. I asked in a sort of joking way that night, and he responded that it was not going to float away, but it wasn't looking good. And that's kind of when I knew that I should listen to my wife and we should leave the house.
I want you to relive a little of your feelings there. I remember here in the American West being out in a wilderness area when the flash flood grew in the stream and the waters rose and rose and rose and rose. I remember how I felt. I didn't know where it was going to end. I never felt really in personal danger, but I do remember that feeling. What was yours?
I mean, the water obviously is the main focus of a flood, but the thing that struck me the most, we live at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, and the bridge below our house is the first bridge that stream hits coming out of the forest. And so everything it picked up on the way downhill got pinned against our bridge. And it sounds like hyperbole, but there was a 50-foot log jam up against what was left of our bridge when I came back to the property. And I could see the damage the waters had done. But to me, the sort of awesome power and after effect of lifting so many trees and everything that was in its way and then leaving them there in front of our house, that's what struck me the most, I think. And just seeing people's lives in that too, seeing doors and, a washing machine pinned against the branches below my house. So everything that had once been someone's life, had been carried to us and then pinned there.
What do you make of the improbability that this should ever have happened, so far inland from the ocean?
Yeah, we have one storm that kind of parallels this one from 1916, and many of us who grew up in the region heard tell of that story. My grandmother pointed me at some point to a newspaper article of my great-grandfather recalling his time delivering the mail during that storm. And so I had some sense of that storm. This one was bigger, of course, but not something anyone ever anticipates. We're, in the mountains of North Carolina and southern Appalachia. Hurricanes are not things that we tend to fear. I grew up as a kid learning in elementary school that we were generally safe. Tornadoes bounced off the mountains, I remember hearing when I was a kid, and hurricanes couldn't reach us. And so it's not something that we ever planned for sure, even though, a century or so ago, something pretty similar did hit us.
There's a door here to a very important aspect of your life, and it is that you heard from the people around you who were older all the way back to 1916 that had happened. And there were people with pretty deep local knowledge, weren't there?
There were, in fact, one of the areas that got hit hardest is a little community called Back Cave, which is just above Chimney Rock. And someone told me later that the floodwaters got just to the edge of the fire department there. And they found that pretty miraculous. And then they started asking around, and they learned that when that fire department had been built, it had been built by men who had lived through the first flood. And so they wanted to build it above that flood line. And so that's in some ways what saved it, was just that memory and that knowledge.
I grew up in the West. I don't know very much at all about where you grew up, and I'd just like you to take us there. Deep roots for your family there.
Yeah, deep roots. My family's been really in one county of Western North Carolina for about 200 years, which feels pretty deep for me now, although I will say that I teach at a university called Western Carolina, which sits on land that had belonged to the Cherokee, and recently they built a new science building here, and in the process of digging out the foundation, they were pulling up things from the 10th century. So my 200 years feels kind of tiny compared to that. But my family's been in this one place for a long time. The Blue Ridge Mountains are very old. So if you think about the West, you sort of have these jagged peaks that you can picture. I remember flying into Denver for the first time and just being struck by how the mountains just sort of rise out of nowhere, like this wall. Here, everything's rolling and soft. These mountains are older than the Himalayas, and so they have been worn down and everything feels softer. I always imagine it's like a green blanket's just sort of been laid down over everything. And the land, there's a lot of protected land. So a lot of what you see was national forest. And so it's kept everything pretty green and kept us in a place that feels time-worn or eternal. It feels like things haven't changed for a long time, even though, of course, they have.
When Jeremy was a little kid, he loved roaming his family's land. This was his world. He felt an organic, unconscious connection to the county, to his living relatives, and even people of past generations.
I was a feral kid, to be honest. I grew up on land that my dad's family has been on for 5 generations. And so the 100 or so acres that they've been living on were now settled by my dad and his brothers and my grandparents. And so my dad and his 3 brothers all had sons. And so we were just sort of a roaming gang, through the woods as kids. And then my mom's family grew up on the land just across the creek from my dad's family. And so as a kid, there's this kind of amazing mix of wildness where I felt like I could go anywhere and sort of experience anything. But I also felt the safety of that because I couldn't escape family land. I could roam all day and never get beyond my family's land. And then, my grandma who kept us a lot in the summers would always go out to her car. She would blow the horn 3 times when we were supposed to come back, and that was our homing beacon. Otherwise, we were free. And I think that, all of the sort of mystery and purpose that comes when you're a kid in the woods with your imagination, I thought that was the normal way to exist, I think, at the time. And now looking back, I realize kind of how amazing that was.
Jeremy, you mentioned woods, and I didn't have woods in Southern California where I was growing up. Chaparral we had, but no real forest to speak of. And so when I was the feral kid outdoors, I was looking for horny toads and lizards and trapdoor spiders. What were you finding in the woods?
My parents' house is completely surrounded by forest. And so even though we were on family land and my grandma's house was through the woods and my uncle's house was up the hill, we couldn't see anyone else. And so we're surrounded by these big caves of rhododendron. They're just these massive kind of networks almost of rhododendron. And as a kid, when we didn't have some spy mission that my cousins and I were at work on, I love to go into those and just kind of disappear. You can climb up them. They're strong enough to be in. I realized when I was pretty young that if you stayed put long enough, everything around you would resume. When I was stepped into the woods and started making racket, the rabbits would stop and the squirrels would disappear and the birds' song would change. But if I stayed in there long enough and kind of just found a perch in the rhododendron and stayed put, things would resume. And that's how I loved to be. And I think some of it was just usual boy wanting to be in some kind of spy movie. When I would hear a car coming down the road, I would jump in the ferns and try to disappear or try to sneak around and spy on people with binoculars. But really for me, the woods as a kid was a place to kind of feel like you're a part of something that is totally beyond your creation. It's not something that I've made. I'm just stepping into and then letting it wash over me in some ways.
Maybe it was fairy tales for me, but the woods always meant big bad wolf. Did you have fear?
I didn't, and maybe that was foolish at the time. I don't know why I didn't. The biggest thing that people think about here are bears, but we only have black bears, and they're pretty scaredy cats, really, if you make enough noise.
No fear of getting lost even?
No, getting lost, like I said, was kind of hard to do. I remember this moment when we had a lot of rain when I was a kid, and we lived on a place called Clear Creek, and it got high enough to escape its banks. And I remember it was high enough that we could put a canoe in it, which was not something we could normally do. And so we paddled, my cousins and I, downstream. And I remember getting out of the canoe and not knowing where I was, and it felt pretty different. And we weren't that far from our family land, but everything looked different because there was a lot of bottomlands. And so that land that normally looked like sod or whatever they were growing looked like a rice paddy, it was covered in water. And I remember being thrilled by that. I was thinking about getting on the Mississippi and floating and sort of popping out somewhere, even though we're on Clear Creek in Fruitland, North Carolina, and we've gone maybe a mile downstream. That's one of the few times that I remember feeling lost.
So from what I've heard so far, nothing in your childhood rose to the level of the inundation that took the old house that we spoke of earlier.
No, the flood that hit, when I was an adult and a parent and in a different stage of life was not something I had any kind of analog for, really.
After a charmed childhood, the teenage Jeremy started feeling too confined in his world. The bigger he grew, the smaller it seemed. Listen to him explain why he started eyeing roads out of town.
I grew up in a way that feels magical looking back on it now, but when I was a teenager, I still remember this moment of going down to my great-great-grandparents' house and looking out across the creek and seeing the cemetery where most of my family's been buried and feeling terrified by that idea. I just felt so claustrophobic as a teenager, thinking about these people who had been living on this land and then laid into it for eternity. And that felt very small to me. And so when I was, thinking about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life and all the knowledge that comes at age 17. I knew that I had in mind that everything that mattered was happening somewhere else.
His first credible foray into the broader world came when he enrolled in Elon University, about 8 counties away from his own. After earning his degree, he got much further away than just that, going to various parts of the United States and even to Central America. This was during his 20s and early 30s. I wanted to know from Jeremy if he was just seeking adventure away from home or maybe actually trying to escape. Equal parts excitement about the broader world and that get me out of here impulse? What really made the decision for you to leave?
Yeah, it wasn't that there was anything terrible I was running from, but I think I just had this notion that life was happening somewhere else. I was a pretty idealistic college kid thinking that if I was going to do something that mattered in the world, I needed to go somewhere and do something that mattered. There were lots of reasons that I came back and, discovering writers like Wendell Berry and ways to open doors back home. But at that time, I just felt like life was happening in places that were different from the place that I grew up.
Still, all the while he was away from home as a younger man, he could never quite shake the sympathies, acquired in childhood, for the mountainous places he knew so well. Somewhere deep in his psyche was a latent sort of hankering to be back again, deep in the woods with its rich delights of roaming, unfettered and half-wild, climbing rhododendron or canoeing a mountain stream. He even started to wonder if the people and places of western North Carolina hadn't left an indelible stamp on him, a noticeable temperament as a very specific kind of human being, a mountain person. College students are known for being self-reflective, so no sooner had he left home than he started to wonder if this type of persona wasn't his genuine identity. Recurring ruminations about identity had initially been prompted by a certain experience that hinted at how other people might possibly view him.
I was 18 when I left for college, and I had a moment that really shifted everything for me. I was in college out of the mountains, and my car broke down, and somebody had to come help us. And I had my girlfriend at the time, my now wife, were clueless about how to fix this car, and the guy that stopped to help us was making small talk, and we told him where we were from, and he said, "Oh, you're mountain folk." And I was like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be mountain folk? So I think that was one of the first times I started even playing with the idea that people in the mountains were somehow different.
Another experience from his college days.
One of my classes had taken a trip into the mountains where I was from, and all the other college students in the class were from other places. And I remember we were crossing a little stream. There was a tree down across it, and so I crossed it. And 2 guys came behind me to cross the stream, and they both fell in. Somebody on the bank, some other student, yelled, "You can't follow Jeremy out here because he's a mountain man." And I remember thinking that was funny but odd.
Even down in Central America, this lingering question dogged him about being a mountain person at heart.
And it wasn't until I moved to Honduras and started recognizing features that felt like mountain people in Honduran people. And I started then, of course, pointing that back to myself and wondering, am I a mountain person? What does it mean to be a mountain person? People who lived there, which was in the mountains, felt different from people that I was meeting on the coast of Honduras or that I had met in Costa Rica. And I think that started me asking questions about how we're shaped by the places we're from and how I was shaped by the place that I grew up.
Mountain people, that was the term Jeremy eventually identified with most, but there was a contender. North Carolina is, of course, part of the American South, and Southerner, by some measures, might equally well have been a fit for him. He was, after all, born in the South, grew up there, and lives there even today. But the South is a big collage and a complicated place, stitched together out of multiple adjacent regional cultures that nevertheless can be differentiated. And when Jeremy started looking more closely at his own family history, he detected characteristic markers of the southernmost stretch of Appalachia that made it its own kind of place.
I had a classmate who cried when he learned that the South lost the Civil War. And the more that I thought about that moment, and the more that I learned about the history of where I'm from, I realized just how complicated of an idea Southernness is. And it's, often just tied to that Mason-Dixon line. But I live in a place where most or at least half of my relatives fought for the Union. The mountains of North Carolina were not easily divided along those lines. And so what does that make the place that I'm from? Does it make it Southern? Does it not? And so I think Appalachian is sometimes a whole different animal regionally.
Have you figured it out?
No, I haven't, but I continue to ask. I think that's a question that's evolving, just like the South is evolving. And I think it's a useful question to ask. But I think the question sometimes, that may be better is like, what do we want it to be? What do we want the South to be? What do we want Appalachia to be? And sometimes that means looking back to find some answers, and sometimes it means looking elsewhere, looking forward.
Well, do you sometimes look back and find the wrong answers?
For sure. I think, I've I spent the last decade or so in the diaries of my fourth great grandfather, who kept diaries from 1808 to 1859. And so his whole life was bookended really by two wars, by the Revolutionary War and by the Civil War. So I get this portrait of a man's life starting in South Carolina, moving to the North Carolina mountains, and just the very beginnings of the idea of America. And as you might imagine, there's a lot in there to look back on and sort of ponder, and a lot to look back on and feel ashamed about or feel grateful that we've moved on from.
Yeah. I can identify with this so well. I grew up as an urban kid in California, but in the summers we'd go visit relatives in Utah. And there in a tiny little community, there were 12, 15, 20 different houses of cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents. And they were so close to each other, and relatively close. Maybe there was a 40-acre field of alfalfa separating some of them. But to go to a place like that, these were my people, I was told, and I got to meet them. How dense was that network for you?
I mean, I think that's part of what sent me home, too, is that I grew up, not only on my family land, but a lot of the people I knew grew up on family land, too. I had friends a few miles down the road who had dirt bikes, and we could get through the woods on various trails to get to other friends' houses without knowing exactly whose land we were crossing. And so it was sort of a network of lots of different family land. And that felt like the way that everybody lived until I left. And so I think that when I met other people in other parts of the world and learned that they were growing up in totally different ways than I had grown up, it made me look back on that, just kind of free-flowing life that I had as a kid with some longing and wanting to know, why is it that my family stayed on one piece of land for 5 generations? Like, that's a strange thing to do in some ways if you look at the scope of American history. Not everybody stays put for that long. And so some of that, I think, having those conversations with other people, forcing me to reflect back on, what it meant to be able to ride dirt bikes from Adam's house to Brandon's house, made me start asking questions about the place that I'd come from and what it means to be in it. Questions that soon emerged: what does it mean for us to do with this land next? What happens when some of these pieces of forest are no longer forest, and all those sorts of questions.
I find it fascinating here how Jeremy's line of inquiry pivots a bit from the strict question of personal identity, who am I, to a question of a place's identity and how stable it is, whether it will stay the same or change. Any of us might, of course, ask, what does my own being in a place, and my family's being there, mean for the place itself? And I kind of think that for Jeremy, getting a fresh take on the situation from far away was vital as he tried to address these questions fairly.
When I moved to Honduras, I was, teaching 4th grade and not prepared to do that at all, but trying to figure out as I went. But something that unlocked for me in college was the empty page and the written word. And I found myself in Honduras every afternoon writing. And there was no reason, there was no assignment, there was no reader, but I was writing anyway. And I think that was the first place where I realized I was trying to make sense of the world, alone at a computer or by hand. And that's when I started writing about home. I was living as far away from home as I'd ever been at that point. I just knew that I wanted to figure out what it meant to be from a place. And so what I had were these memories and these stories. And so I started, coming at them every time I sat down to write.
I just love the part of your life story where you end up teaching at an elementary school, the one of your own childhood where you attended school, but shoulder to shoulder with the older educators who had taught you.
All of them. My kindergarten teacher through my 5th grade teacher, all of my former teachers were still in that building.
That's crazy.
And they wanted me to call them by their first names, which was the weirdest thing to do. I mean, I think that moving back home felt in a way like going into a time machine. You know, it still smelled the same as when I was a kid. All the games they were playing in PE were the same games that I had played as a kid. And yet I had on a tie and people were calling me Mr. Jones.
Writing was one avenue for probing his roots and essential identity. Another avenue? Learning to play the banjo.
I did learn to play the banjo, so I think that allows me to take the mantle of mountain folk, you know.
You strum or you pluck?
A little bit of both. I play clawhammer banjo.
Claw? Oh, yeah, I've seen pictures of those.
Yeah.
Do you play dulcimer? My wife is from Appalachia. She's from up in West Virginia, though, and she has a dulcimer.
Yeah, I've got a dulcimer.
I thought you might. You got the banjo anywhere nearby?
The joke about the banjo is you spend half the time tuning and half the time playing out of tune. But an old-time banjo, you play in different tunings to kind of match the fiddle. So this is something in C tuning. This is called, let's see. This is called Fly Around My Pretty Little Miss.
A confirmed traveler after years abroad finally settles into life as a hometown homebody. Well, that's one angle on the life story of writer and professor Jeremy Jones, who returned to the mountainous region that had made him, and who, together with his family, when they got there, found an old farmhouse to call their own. Maybe everything you've heard so far in this episode is backstory to the adventure with the farmhouse, an old structure with some hidden history. Jeremy Jones is author of the nonfiction book Cipher, Decoding My Ancestor's Scandalous Secret Diaries, as well as the memoir titled Bearwallow, A Personal History of a Mountain Homeland. He also regularly contributes essays to the magazine Our State, celebrating North Carolina. I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. I've worked with lots of younger kids, including my own, and I know firsthand the great feeling of finding just the right kind of educational listening for younger folk. We've got a podcast perfectly suited for younger hearts and minds. It's the Constant Wonder Kids podcast. Stories from the original Constant Wonder podcast featured in a way that's totally accessible for children from about kindergarten age until they hit middle school. Many of these episodes are adventure stories out in nature with fascinating people who go out into the wide world to see its wonder and awe. Curious, developing kids love this podcast, as well as the grown-ups who guide and love these kids. True stories about ocean divers, bird scientists, volcanologists, non-experts who rescue animals and rewild and replant damaged habitats. Positive stories about people doing positive things for the world. Would you like to get inside the mind of a bee, or find tiny hummingbird eggs, or go in search of seahorses? Maybe discover amazing ways that some plants can think and communicate. Constant Wonder Kids is perfect for road trips, bedtime listening, maybe just for whenever your brain's got an itch that needs to be scratched. New episodes drop on Mondays. Tune in to Constant Wonder Kids on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to Constant Wonder. So, the house that the flood waters damaged. Let's go back to where you acquired that home and why you were choosing to do that. I mean, when I think about buying a new home, I think I'm going to buy new, instead of old.
That's smart. My wife and I are both very into old houses. She grew up in a very old house. I grew up, as I said, on this land that's been in my family for multiple generations, and all those houses are still there. My great-great-grandparents' house is still there. My great-grandparents' house is still there. So I have an affinity for old houses, too. It's not a smart economic decision, but we love old houses. And so we found this house, and this is on the other side of the county from where I grew up. So still in Henderson County, but 30-minute drive from where I grew up and where my family's land is. We found this house. No one knows exactly when it was built. They tell me between 1840 and 1870 it was built. Up the mountain around 1900, they rolled it on logs down and set it along the South Fork of the Mills River.
What was the appeal of this house other than just going to a new spot?
Yeah, this is a farmhouse that's built about 10 feet up the bank, but right on the river. I mean, there's a little sunroom that almost overhangs the river. And then through the yard, there's a stream that feeds into the river. And so the house is kind of surrounded by water. Nothing is a 90-degree angle in the house because it's been moved and added onto. Everything sort of feels like it's listening in a way, which might scare some people off. But for us, felt like we had found something that felt solid. You know, it's been in this one place for over a century. And so the house felt inviting in that way because we knew that it was going to last.
As Jeremy and his family were settling into their new but also very old house on Mills River, taking stock of everything there, he started learning things about it he had never suspected. Facts so compelling as to explain why the house had drawn them like a magnet. They had felt an instant draw, not just to any old house, but to this particular one. I asked him how the puzzle pieces started falling together in a way that, well, I'm going to say almost shouted that the acquisition was meant to be.
By luck, as these things seem to happen, I was in the river with my kid looking for hellbenders, which are these kind of salamanders that live here, and found this big chunk of black something or other that we pulled out. It looked volcanic. You know, it was like magma that had hardened, which of course it wasn't.
Not at all shaped like a hellbender, was it?
Not at all shaped like a hellbender. About the size of a softball, but not circular either. And my kid said, "Oh, that's iron." And I said, "How do you know? That's not iron." But, you know, Minecraft is very popular with kids. And so sure enough, it was iron. And I started doing some research and learned that about 100 yards upstream, there had been an iron forge. And what I had found was the slag from that forge that operated, 100 years ago. And then learned that that forge had been started and operated by my sixth great-grandfather and then his sons and then his grandson. And I had no idea that that forge was there, that it had been run by my family until we picked up this black chunk, from the bottom of the river and started asking questions.
Yeah, but the house itself then plays into this story too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it didn't take long before I found the placement of the iron forge that I started tracing deeds back and back and back and back, which involves a lot of going to historical societies and asking people questions who know how to read these documents better than I do. But ultimately, I discovered that the house was built by my fifth great uncle. And that means that everything that we sort of felt pulled to in this house had been put there by my family. And I had no idea when we moved in.
Yeah. These stories of coincidence, we really thrive on them. And I just want to know, did you say, oh my, or did you say, that's funny, or somewhere in between? Where did this register for you when you put it all together?
I was pretty excited. My wife, who grew up in the same county as I did, but who grew up in a different part of it, and who knows that I have these very deep roots in this county, was not surprised. I came to her so excited that I had found out this house was built by a distant ancestor, and she said, of course it was. Because she's just used to bumping into people across the county and me saying, oh, it turns out I'm related to this person. And she says, of course you are. So I think she was, less surprised. But for me, it was a startling discovery, which may sound silly considering my family's been in one place for so long. But like I said, my family's land is on the other side of this county. And so this felt, like a pretty far stretch to find so many family roots kind of just inside the house.
You have described that when this puzzle came together and you started snapping the pieces side by side, that your attitude, your temperament kind of shifted in relation to the actual place, the home.
Yeah, it was no longer just a place to live. Everything in it, I was thinking about who had put it there and what the lives might have been like for the people who lived in it. I think about the river that's just down the bank from our house. That water's been moving through there for longer than I can even imagine. And so I suddenly was, maybe this sounds like I'm losing it a little bit. But I was imagining what would it have been like for my fourth great grandfather to be standing in that stream? What would it have been like for my sixth great grandfather to be forging iron just up that stream? And so thinking about all the lives that had been in that place and on that land suddenly made this more than just a house. We'd been in so many different houses before and sold them and fixed them up. And this suddenly was more like an artifact that we got a chance to be in. And I also felt just some responsibility for keeping it up. It was not a place that I thought would disappear when I die. This is a place that may carry on and someone might come behind me and live in it. And so I felt, this may sound kind of over the top, but I felt like it was my duty as another family member stepping into this home to do the best I could to keep it up.
I think there's another layer here, too, that you haven't maybe mentioned overtly yet. Wendell Berry, he uses the word affection. I'm wondering if, with that duty, if it was not married to affection.
Sure, yeah. Wendell Berry was one of the reasons that I think I could even find the language or even find the direction to come back to a place like that. When I discovered Berry's work, it was the first time that I tracked that there are people who are writing about the place that I come from or places like it, that everything doesn't have to be some urban setting or an exciting place, that there are people writing about cow pastures, and that's of value too. And so I think by that point, having moved away and decided to move back, I had this real affection for the place in general, but then finding out this story about the house, suddenly everything in it felt like it was a part of me. There's this great Seamus Heaney line that place in me and me in place, this sort of reciprocal relationship between a place that it's changing you, but you're also changing it. That really, came to the forefront of my mind as soon as I learned about these things and looked around me and realized, my family's been here for so long, and people will come after us and we'll be here for so long. And this is my brief moment to do something with it.
So you've just heard Jeremy express the responsibility he feels for this old house. Now, Jeremy's a literary guy, an admired writer in his own right. So he's bound to forgive me for pressing into service here a famous thought from John Ruskin. That's a pretty big name in 19th century English writing. Ruskin was commenting about our built environments. But I think the idea he offered fits right in with maintaining and repairing and preserving something that we ourselves may not have built. Here's the quote. "When we build, says Ruskin, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight nor for present use alone. Let it be such a work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think as we lay stone on stone, that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred, because our hands have touched them." Now, admittedly, when we build or repair something like a house, there's no guarantee it will last. Which brings us back now to where we started, Hurricane Helene. I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed and host Sam Payne. It's one of many shows from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Wrap yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. You'll hear live studio audiences taking immense delight in a broad tapestry of tales, some humorous, others poignantly reflective. The Appleseed is always a family-friendly experience. It sparks imagination creative enough to make fiction feel like fact and bring real-life events back to life. The Appleseed. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. So emotional investment in the place that grows, and then the hurricane.
Yeah, the hurricane in the mountains. I didn't know what to expect when I drove back to the house, and it took a long time to get to it. The thing about the hurricane, just to give people a sense of what it was like, there were lots of floods, of course. Every stream rose to levels that we had never seen before, but there was also so much wind that the sides of the mountains looked like you had brushed a dog's hair the wrong way. You would just had all these trees just down, so that everything looked discolored and just strange. And so just trying to get to the house from a few miles away was almost impossible because the roads were impassable. But when I got there, I expected the house to be gone. And I remember pulling up The bridge had separated from the land. There was no way to get to it, but looking across, and it was still standing there. And I was surprised and grateful, and naively thought, we'll just do a little cleaning up and then we'll be back in. But of course, it was not that simple. But the house stayed; it didn't float away.
When the raging storm had subsided enough for Jeremy to get near the river, close enough to see the old family farmhouse with his own eyes, yes, it had withstood the worst, but it was also clear that to make it habitable again would probably take years. The bridge leading to it was torn from both banks by the pressure of uprooted trees that had washed down from high upstream, up in the woods. A 50-foot log jam had dislodged the bridge and pinned it somewhere else in the middle of the river. Further up the mountain, neighbors who, unlike Jeremy's family, had chosen to ride out the storm rather than evacuate, had no way out. The community rallied.
We had only been living in the house for a few years when the hurricane hit and hadn't done a great job of getting to know everybody. But there were a handful of families up the mountain behind my house who were effectively cut off from the world after the hurricane. The bridge was gone. There was no way out. Most of these people were people who were prepared. They had generators, they had chainsaws, they were used to taking care of themselves. But not everybody was in that situation. And so I think I realized at some stage it felt like life was moving along in the past, like we had moved backwards 100 years. I remember thinking about what my house looked like when it was first built, and how we were kind of living in ways that people might have lived when it was first built, because, we couldn't drive anywhere. We had no vehicles. We would meet up at the edge of the river. We would decide what we were going to do that day to try to make things better, and then we would go our separate ways. I have to imagine that people farming in these communities and doing things that required community 100 years ago might have been doing something similar. But suddenly I needed people, to help me pull things out of my house, and my neighbors needed people to help cut them a path up the mountain to get to things. We needed each other in a way that we had never needed each other, I think, before. That moment when I came back to the house and I couldn't get to it, my neighbors were across the river looking across at me, and they couldn't get out. And it was so loud. I mean, the water had come down, but it was so loud we couldn't even hear each other. We were just trying to kind of call to each other. And I went back the next day, and they were already building footbridges to try to lay across so that we could get to one another. The first thing we had to do was to build a bridge before we did anything else. As a writer, the metaphorical opportunities there did not escape me. This was happening in an election year. There were all these things nationally that felt like tensions that suddenly were gone when you're in a place where you have no cell service, you have no access to the outside world physically or, through your data plan. All we had was what was in front of us, and we had problems to solve. And it made me think about Wendell Berry, who I got to spend some time with one time, and he told me that, the thing that matters the most is to find a problem in front of you and deal with it. And so, the bridge was the first thing, and maybe the most important thing we did.
You going to get back into that house?
That's a good question. I would like to. We're trying. The smart thing to do would have been to tear it down. A family friend came to help us who works in flood and fire restoration. He said to me, if we tear this house down, I can build you a really nice house here. And I felt gut punched by that. Not just because we loved the house, but because at that point I had learned it was a family home, and I felt, as I said, some responsibility to keeping it up. And so I tossed that idea aside immediately. And we're working to get back in. Some of it is just making sure that we have what we need to make the house a kind of house that can withstand another storm if it comes, make it better and make it stronger.
You've already said it didn't float, the house away. A lot of mud, knee high, ankle high, chest high?
Yeah, about 3 feet of water moved through the house and all the way across our yard. I found things that were ours 300, 400 yards downstream. So when I came back to the house, it was mostly just inches and inches of mud. Every cabinet that had been closed was open. Things that we had in boxes had floated away. Even the floor, we have wood floors in the house, had been pulled up from under the house in pieces. And so we kind of walked in and just found holes all throughout the first floor of the house.
There's so many people who lost houses completely. And I'm sure that at some level you've said, you've done the comparison thing. Well, it wasn't that bad compared to so-and-so. But the big issue for me is not really sort of like the infrastructure of the buildings. That matters. The history of the building matters. Your family connections matter. I want to know about your consolation. Where did your family find any consolation during this?
I think that for my immediate family, we had to search for a place to live, and we've landed in my grandparents' house back on family land, and that has been such a surprising way to reconnect with the place that I grew up. I suddenly have my kids walking the trails that I walked as a kid, that my dad walked as a kid, and sort of on down the line. We would have probably never made a decision to move into an 1,100 square foot house with our family of 4 and 3 animals, but it's been pretty sweet. There's a kind of richness in that. We've been planting food in the same garden where my grandfather had a garden my whole life. And so there are these sort of cycles of life that I've been discovering that are generational, that we're getting to take part in.
Cleaning out the mud, seeing the floorboards and everything that had washed away. Any surprises in there? What did you find?
Gold, a lot of gold. No, I found nothing
that's in Minecraft too, isn't it?
Right, yeah, that's right. I found swords and all sorts of things. Nothing probably exciting beyond me, but the things that I found, it was almost like a Russian nesting doll of a house. The more that we pulled walls out, we found other walls behind those walls, until we got to the original structure that was built, in the mid-19th century. And so I think the strangest thing for me was pulling out these little hand-forged nails that had been put in the house initially, and knowing that it was probably iron from my, 5th great grandfather's forge. It had been put in this wall by my ancestor as well. And so pulling these things out that have held the house together for so long, and knowing that people that I'll never meet, but I'm still sort of carrying in my body, I'd put them in the walls. I think that was, almost a little miracle that I didn't expect to find and didn't want to find. I didn't want to have to go tear my house apart, but in so doing, it became a kind of museum of the people that I come from.
Yeah, I'm imagining they're not like Home Depot cylindrically shaped nails. Are these like those flat, like square nails?
Yeah, and I did an event at this museum. It was like a 19th century working farm that's also a museum, and I called them hand cut. And someone who was an ironsmith came and corrected me afterwards and said they were forged nails. They're not uniform in shape. They hardly look sharp enough to go into the walls. But what you're imagining is indeed what I was pulling out.
I love the story of as you were cleaning up, I think it was your mom or your dad brought a pitchfork out and you were using it and you didn't treat it right. There was some terrible infraction on your part. What happened?
Yeah, I put it on the ground carelessly and nearly stepped on it. And I didn't think too much about it, but she quickly let me know that had been my great-grandfather's pitchfork and probably his father's before him. And so it was not something to be stomped on as I'm clearing brush out of the woods.
Where'd she get it from?
As these things go, people just inherit them and they're just passed down. It made me think a lot of that Alice Walker story, Everyday Use. I felt like the daughter who'd gone off and come back and wanted to take these quilts and display them in the museum. And the mother wants her to know that these are quilts that you still use. And I think that my impulse as someone who's gone off and coming back to think academically about place, it's like, oh, we should take this pitchfork and hang it up on a wall. But we're still using it. We should keep using it, but hopefully not destroy it in the process like I almost did.
Through this whole conversation, Jeremy, I've been, of course, comparing my life experience in my places with your life experience in your places. And when we use that word roots, it just seems almost, superficial sometimes, which roots aren't. They go down, they hold on, they can be tenacious. And sometimes I almost feel like they were meant to be.
Yeah, the strange thing about living back on my family property in my grandma's house right now is that a lot of the forest around her house has grown up, and yet I'll find myself or I'll find one of my kids taking a path that used to be a trail. The trails through my woods have been something that I reflect on a lot because I don't know where they started. Like, I don't know if my dad cut it or his dad or his, great-grandfather, because we've been on this one piece of land for so long. We follow these paths that have been sort of laid out for us, but I don't know where they started. And then I start wondering about geology and tectonic plates. And the reasons that we move through places often have to do with the way the land's situated. And so sometimes I wonder if we're not predestined to kind of take this one path because that's just how the grade of the hill is sort of laid out. Sometimes the way that I move through a place has more to do with that place than it does me, and just being willing to kind of go where it leads me. There's this line from a writer named Gretel Ehrlich that I like a lot. It comes from her book, The Solace of Open Spaces. And I can't remember the exact quote, but she says in it essentially that as a person, you're made up of more than just events, but you're made up of the generational weight, is the word she uses, of one's family and a land-bound sense of place.
Where does all the wonder fit in?
At this point, written 2 books that are largely about place and family history. And yet, I keep discovering new things. My great-grandmother used to tell me that she had come from a family of abolitionists. And I didn't necessarily know that to be true. I think we often tell ourselves stories about our families that we wish were true, but maybe aren't. But then as I've been digging around in this family history, I found that her great-grandfather, was a man named Silas Sitton, went off as soon as he could at the age of 18 to fight for the Union Army. And so now I'm wondering, is there something to this story? The more that I tug on a thread, the more that comes with it. I think figuring out the questions to ask and making sure to pay attention, I'm finding wonder around me all the time.
Yeah. There's something about reaching into the past. I have a second great-grandfather. I discovered he was involved in a war crime in what was called the Utah War of 1857, 1858-ish. And that's kind of hard to do because I see a flawed individual, perhaps even severely flawed individual, but reaching back still, even that in itself is a kind of a bridge that matters to me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And maybe I'm just the target audience for that idea, but I find myself going back to the past a lot, mostly just trying to figure out what I'm made of, even in terms of genetics, what's sort of passed on to us, but also all the things that are unspoken, all the gestures that are passed on. We inherit these things without having any clear sense of where they come from. But in discovering these ancestors, and in my case, I had this rare opportunity to find 50 years of a diary, I can sort of track these inheritances for better or worse and start to ask questions about the place that I live now and kind of what comes next. It's not just an exercise in looking at the past, but also figuring out, I know what I've inherited, I know what I have in my body and also in my family, but what do I do with that? What comes next?
Well, I do hear some consolation in that, I reckon. I reckon. You got a problem with that word?
I love the word reckon. It's one of my favorite words.
But you say you can't use it fairly nowadays. What's the deal?
I feel like I've lost it. I don't know. I learned, whether this was true or not, I learned in high school that if you had a thick accent, you got relegated to the vocational halls. I felt like the people with the thickest accents were often in the shop classes. And I wanted to go to college, and so I decided I should sound like it. And I started kind of systematically washing away my accent, I think. I'm sad about it now that I've come back home. And one of the words that I miss the most is reckon. It's a word that my parents use, that my grandparents use. But whenever I use it, it just sounds like I'm putting on like an Australian accent or something. It feels like I'm just trying out a little party trick. Even though I have access to it and can say it, it doesn't come as naturally as I wish it would. Maybe if I'm here longer, I think I did say it to my grandma recently without thinking too hard about it. So maybe I just need to keep trying and it'll come naturally. I heard myself cough the other day and it sounded like my dad coughing. And I think that could be genetic or it could be learned. And I don't know that I'll know exactly the answer, but it also might not matter. And so for me, as a person who's lived on land that my family's been on for so long, I had to come to terms with the fact that so much of who I am, in maybe an untraceable way, is shaped by that, and is shaped by the sort of abiding on a piece of property for so long, abiding inside a family for so long. And so I think that, I don't know if I believe in ghosts or not, but we can't really escape these kind of hauntings.
Jeremy B. Jones is a writer and professor in North Carolina. He is the author of the book Cipher, Decoding My Ancestors' Scandalous Secret Diaries, as well as the memoir Bearwallow, A Personal History of a Mountain Homeland. 3 of the music performances heard in this episode were performed by Jeremy himself, playing the banjo and singing. Those pieces were My Homes Across the Blue Ridge Mountains, Fly Around My Pretty Little Miss, and Ramblin' Hobo. Jess Scoville produced this episode with assistance from Lydia McElroy. Our sound production was by Adam Wells. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.